would you be willing to trade all the days from this day to that for one chance, just one chance, to come back here and tell our enemies that they may take our lives, but they'll never take our freedom!
And welcome to Anti-Tyranny News Radio here on UCY.tv. Thank you for joining me this evening. Now that we have President Donald Trump, he's already started, making executive orders and decisions, some of which many of us agree with, some of which the policies we definitely disagree with, and really we're looking to see what the landscape of this presidency is going to paint. Really, it's very iffy right now, and we're not just looking at the economy. We're looking at military involvement across the world. We're looking at border issues. We're looking at trade issues, and TPP being one of them that we have pulled out of through executive order, and that's one that many of us agree with. But we also have to look at how that plays out in the world and what steps do we take when it comes to free trade. And we already know Donald Trump's talked about tariffs and everything. So we have to really be very careful of, how much we cheer something on without knowing what the plans are that this administration is going to look at, basically to replace what we're pulling out of. And they've talked about making other agreements with these other countries to come up with better deals. We will have to see what type of talks we're talking about and what these better deals are, and how that's going to affect the economy. I'm going to get into a short clip here from We Are Change, the worst and best actions by Trump so far and the real threat. And he covers some things here, and then we'll kind of go from that into a Ron Paul Liberty report, but I'll probably interrupt this clip here a few times. So let's go ahead and dive into this.
In this video, I want to talk about the worst and also the best decision that Donald Trump has made officially as president of the United States, and also talk about an existential threat that a lot of people don't seem too worried about, but is very important and should be understood. Now, just moments ago, Donald Trump has signed an executive order to withdraw from the TPP. He's also expected to sign other executive orders that would renegotiate NAFTA. This was a very big popular move by Donald Trump because, as we know, the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, was drafted in secret with heads of states and corporations. And the only reason we knew about the TPP was because of WikiLeaks and the EFF. They had free speech clause agreements in there that would ruin free speech. So Donald Trump literally saved memes and did the right thing that he promised to do. Even Hillary Clinton was for the TPP, but then was against it when she saw the public outrage. So this is a very good populist move by Donald Trump and a kick in the balls to the corporatocracy and globalist, and to me personally, the best decision he has made so far as president of the United States. Now, the worst decision is a combination of two things. Number one, publicly saying that he won't release his tax records again after stating before he would is a very bad move because now it opens the cans of worms of speculation and makes him very vulnerable to attack by not only the media, but people on the left and right, which equally hate him. It looks like they have something to hide here, which is a very important, concerning issue to a lot of people, especially with the economic and financial moves that Donald Trump has previously made before and his ties to foreign government. Now, WikiLeaks offered to help and they said that, oh, they won't release their tax records. Just send them to us. Now that, with Donald Trump's press secretary coming out during his first press conference and not talking about the issues that matter to us, not talking about the plan of action, but deciding to get in a pissing match with the mainstream media was moronic and stupid. Like, why is Donald Trump making loose statements about how there's 1.5 million people at the inauguration? Why is Kellyanne Conway talking about alternative facts? They're digging their hole deeper here. Donald Trump had to tell the National Park Service to stop tweeting, and they did because they did release a biased kind of tweet. But this situation, which has no relevance to the American people, has no substance at all, shows the pure egotistical nature of this whole push by the White House, and their fight with the mainstream media is moronic. And seeing the alternative media even participate in this is a huge waste of time. And this is not what alternative media is supposed to be about. While these dumbasses, alternative media, mainstream media, and Trump administration argue about something so pointless, we're missing the bigger picture here of what's happening on the world stage, especially with China. China's government newspaper used the weekend after U.S. Trump's inauguration to promote China as an alternative to the crisis. They call this a crisis of Western democracy and capitalism. The Chinese even went as far as to say that they would be willing to assume world leadership if needed because Donald Trump says, make America first. China does not, quote, want world leadership, but could be forced to assume that role if others step back from that position, a senior Chinese diplomat said. When he's talking about others, he's directly talking about the United States. And this is a reaction to Donald Trump making and prioritizing America. Now, the president of China also urged countries to resist isolationism, signaling Beijing's desire to play a bigger role on the global world stage. The Chinese foreign minister came out and said, quote, "We still hope that the United States and other Western economies can continue to make an even bigger contribution to the world economic recovery." So we're seeing the Chinese blatantly say, worry about the world, not just the United States. Play on the world economic market, not just on the U.S. economic market. And as we know, China and the United States have not had a good relationship for a very long time. And the situation with Trump coming into office, leading to a potential trade war because Trump has talked about tariffs and taxes on imported Chinese goods.
I want to interrupt. I don't want people to forget about the whole, Russia and China also working on another currency to become the replacement for the U.S. dollar is the petrodollar, and how that might even play into the whole global effect with this in China. And there's something else that plays into that. We'll get into that too.
goods. Now, it's not only a trade war that we should be worried about, but a full-on out war between the second world largest economy, China, and the United States. And the Chinese have even said so. The Chinese has warned Trump to prepare for military clashes in response to his Secretary of State picks, Rex Tillerson's comments. A state-run Chinese media outlet released a statement Friday warning that the Trump administration should, quote, prepare for a military clash. And after making those statements from the Chinese, the United States, a day after that, deployed a third carrier group in Asia to boost its naval air forces in the disputed South China Sea, which have been a major clash point between the United States and China over these man-made military islands that the Chinese are now putting in there along major trade routes. And as we know, Donald Trump won't back away from the Chinese, and that's why he's even planning on having the biggest naval buildup in decades in response to the Chinese. So as this situation is unfolding, there's still these idiots arguing about how many people came to the inauguration, which doesn't matter. Anyway, what do you think is the worst thing that Donald Trump has done so far as president of the United States? What do you think is the best thing he did as president of the United States? Let me know in the comment section below, and as well as what will lead to the United States and China clashing so much as they have been on the world stage. This is a very unpredictable situation that we will be staying tuned to, because this is a lot more important between how many buttholes were at the frickin' inauguration. And if you want more real news, you have to vote with your dollar. Support us on patreon.com/wearechange, because we are fully free, fully independent, only because of your support, your donations, you voting with your dollar.
We are Change, wearechange.org, and We Are Change on YouTube. Go there and subscribe. Now, when we look at the whole global scale, you know, we should be trying to focus heavily on defense. And, you know, we talk about the military buildup. I have, you know, blended views on that. If we're going to start sending, you know, all of our assets out of our territories, I don't see a need for a military buildup. We have many assets already around the world. I think if we did naval buildup, I think it should be spread out, but more localized in defense. We shouldn't be building up military deployments in places that we're not at war with. And if we are to go to war, there should be a true legitimate threat to the safety of Americans on American soil. And that's a kind of sketchy thing, because they go, well, what about all of our military and, you know, all these different bases and everything around the world? Well, one thing that would help is we shouldn't have as many bases as we have. Policemen of the world, you know, should we be that? Now, you know, I'm going to get into a Ron Paul Liberty report here. And cutting waste is part of that. You know, let's not have, you know, I forget how many bases in, you know, over 100 countries. It's a staggering amount of bases that we have on top of our naval presence that, you know, it's basically moving cities in the ocean. So I think we should be able to defend ourselves, but we have to limit aggression to be justified in defense, because otherwise we can be called the offenders. And, you know, there was a Ron Paul Liberty report yesterday. You know, Trump's 31 airstrikes. Is this a taste of things to come? That's one that I definitely urge people to go check out on YouTube, Ron Paul Liberty Report or ronpaullibertyreport.com. But I want to get into this one that has to do with the reform of military spending, Ron Paul Liberty Report. So let's go ahead and dive into that.
Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning into the Liberty Report. With me today is Daniel McAdams, the co-host. Daniel?
Yes.
We've advocated the fact and advertised that our government spends too much money. And most people realize that, but nobody wants to cut anything. But we're going to talk about whether or not we should cut money out of the military. Of course, I think definitions are important.
Yeah.
I want to cut military. I don't want to cut defense, but they always say defense, so that everybody votes for it. But a lot of military spending has nothing to do with defense. But we want to pick up where Christopher Preble led us into a Politico article. And he, of course, is from Cato. And he had an article, The Right Way to Cut Wasteful Spending, defense spending. Well, I'm sure that there's a lot of different ways. There's always temptation. Well, all we have to do is have reform, and we have to, do that. But that in itself is probably not going to be enough. Reform is one thing, but change in policy is something else. Of course, so far we've heard from the administration that we should deal with this, and Trump has mentioned, but it's through sort of an intimidation, threats, and say, well, you do this, and he's good at that, and that may do some good, but that really doesn't quite solve the problem.
Chris, and Chris tackles one aspect of the problems with military spending, and he approaches it in terms of what specifically you can do to cut what a lot of people call waste, fraud, and abuse. And he makes a good point starting out in his article that the U.S. military budget, adjusted for inflation, is more than the average budget at the peak of the Cold War. So we are spending an enormous amount of money. The question is, how do we deal with this? We saw earlier today and yesterday that President Trump is going to instill a hiring freeze for federal workers. That sounds pretty good, except the military is exempted.
Yeah, that's
so
right.
We can go into a little bit more about what Chris says, if you wish, but I would point out his first point is close unneeded bases. That's interesting. But then his examples are only domestic bases that he thinks
Right.
should be cut.
That reminds me of what happened probably in the 1990s when they closed down bases as a way of saving money. And I was not gung-ho over that process because they were cutting mainly the bases at home, which should be closed. They're wasteful. But I argued that, policy should have something to do with this. But if you cut some of the bases at home initially, although I think you should work for that, and building them more overseas, it doesn't solve any problems. At that particular time when they were cutting a few bases at home and getting a lot of grief from people at home, they were building bases at that particular time. They were building a huge base in none other than Saudi Arabia, one of the principal incentives for 9/11 to have come about. And I think that's important. So it invites the discussion about, policy as well as these issues of how you tinker with the budget and the process, because I think it's more than that. There are 800 bases like in the United States that they
overseas.
Altogether.
Worldwide, 800 worldwide bases in over 70 countries.
Yeah. And of course, if we had a policy of defense, this would be a lot different. We don't need to be everywhere. I think this is the opposite of defense. I think it's an aggravation, like I point out about Saudi Arabia. It had nothing to do with our defense. It caused grief for us, and still does. And it still goes back to the old idea: why would people travel 6,000 miles, to come over here if they weren't motivated? And they say, well, it's a religious belief, which is something I don't buy into.
Well, Chris has a challenge in the way he approaches military spending reform because, I think he designs his research to appeal to a lot of people inside the Beltway, and that's understandable. That's where the action is. The American Enterprise, all of these other groups that are neocon dominated, and I think he wants to try to moderate some of what they say, but you're right, it ignores policy, and policy deals with the 800 bases overseas. And I was looking at Professor David Vine. He wrote an excellent book on worldwide U.S. military bases, and a couple of interesting points that he made. The total cost of our bases and troops overseas is between $160 and $200 billion a year. You want to talk about cutting military spending? That's pretty, and most of these are in very wealthy countries: Japan, Europe, et cetera.
Yeah, there's a lot of room, for cutting, but what they're talking about here, this type of reform, isn't going to touch any of that. And besides, even if there is an inkling and they move in that direction, it really doesn't solve these huge problems, the huge amounts of money. And even the weapons system, it's so ingrained in the system. Even if you give, the individuals that want reform and give Trump the benefit of the doubt, it's not going to be enough, because the consensus is Republicans and Democrats alike will not cut the military budget. And Trump said, no, we're going to spend more money on the military. But he has to throw this stuff out there. Well, where are you going to get the money? Well, we're going to, cut waste, fraud, and abuse, and we're going to have this amount of money, which I think is a dream. They're not going to have it, and eventually the debt will be a problem. Right now they're flying high. We still have lenders, and as long as people will let us print money and they'll lend it back to us, we're going to keep doing this for a long time. But the one thing is the law, the economic laws of monetary policy is it doesn't last forever, and that's when this whole thing is going to be a major problem, and it'll be a lot bigger than the problem we're talking about right here.
Yeah, I think the issue is I think the Beltway people see military spending reform coming, and they're trying to shift its focus in areas that are more palatable. The idea that a tweet from Donald Trump to Lockheed Martin saying you need to cut a few $1 million off of the F-35, as that's going to solve the problem of $1 trillion total military budget, is a fallacy. But I think they're trying to shift this toward waste, fraud, and abuse, toward procurement reform, et cetera, because they don't want to deal with the real elephant in the room, which is policy. They feel if they can tinker around with managing some of these little crises, they can continue the policy as it is. And that's their real goal. And we obviously have a different goal.
Yeah, and it to me is a shame that Congress rolls over on this. And one individual, and I like him, and I worked with him, Mick Mulvaney, who now, is OMB,
yeah,
and has a lot to say. But I was a little bit disappointed with his saying about, well, you want to now raise the taxes on Social Security and raise the spending on the military. They said, isn't that different than what you had when you were in the House? He says, yes, but when I was in the House, that was different. Now I'm not in the House. Now I'm in the administration. Reminds me of a story when one individual on the House floor had been voting with the hardcore, with the dozen of us that would vote against the spending. And all of a sudden he started voting in the wrong way. I went over and talk to him. I say, hey, how come you're not with us on this vote? He says, well, I'm in leadership now. So when you're a leader, you're an obedient follower. So once you join, the leadership, then your principles thing, and you rationalize. It's not like you become totally unprincipled. It's just that you become more moderate, and you rationalize and say, well, for me to do any good, I have to be a player. And that's why they said the argument was, Ron, you never did any good. You just came here and voted no. You didn't do any good. But I think that doing the wrong things isn't doing much good either, even if you get your bills passed. So, okay, you don't want any spending. They want a whole lot. I'll get a bill passed. I'm just going to spend a little bit less, or I'm going to have oversight, But they don't talk about real oversight. Oversight, I think, is great. What about, we've talked for a long time about auditing the Fed. Great idea, and people give token, support for that. Even Trump has. But now he has somebody coming into the administration, Mnuchin, and he says, well, we better be careful about what we do with the Fed. But if they're doing this, why wouldn't the charge be, why aren't we auditing the Pentagon? Yeah. How do we know about this? Why don't we someday audit in great detail the people who perpetuate war and initiate wars, and that's the CIA along with the military forces. They go in, the special forces. I mean, that's what we need to know about, where they get the money. And this is a bit cynical, but it's also a bit true. If they don't have enough money to do all this secret fighting and warmongering, they get their money someplace else. And we do know that they've used the drug war to get money to buy weapons when they're in the business of trading weapons to pay some of the bills. So we need an exposure. This is okay, but you're talking about just a little bit when we need a whole lot of reform. But if they're not going to reform and reassess and reanalyze overall interventionism in foreign policy, it's not going to do the trick at all. It's going to pacify people, give them a little bit more time, show that we're strong and powerful. But I think we're still going to be very, very vulnerable, but maybe more vulnerable financially. Militarily, I don't think we're vulnerable militarily. That's what gets to me. It's like look at what they did prior to Iraq. People in this country actually believe Saddam Hussein could launch an intercontinental missile and bomb us with a nuclear bomb, weapons of mass destruction. I mean, they were convinced of this. So I think we're very secure. One thing is they're right when we have a great military. If we are so great and so powerful, although all the other countries put together, why are we worrying about massively increasing the amount the military is going to get? We have good defense, and that's what we need. We don't need more militarization.
And that really is the question. I mean, I wonder where the fault lines are, because I think that people have become accustomed to bread and circuses. You get your Social Security, you get your food stamps, you get all this stuff, and you get a great military where you can wave your flag and cheer on the troops in the wars overseas. What's going to happen to Middle America? And a lot of them are Trump voters. When all of a sudden they come and they say, Mulvaney says, look, we're going to have to cut your Social Security benefits. We're going to cut your food stamps. We're going to cut your other benefits because we want to build the military up more. I think people are going to become concerned, and maybe it'll work to our benefit.
Well, and that will be combined with something else that's going to hit home, and that is that the country and the government will recognize that prices are going up. The CPI is going up right now. They're fed a lie. You talk about fake news. Inflation is not a problem. We're working on making it 2% because we just don't think it's good to have the destruction of the currency at less than 2% a year. So they're working real hard at this. I think price inflation is out there. It's always been in the military. That's why you pay $600 for a hammer. If that's not inflation, I don't know what it is. You have inflation in education. You have inflation in medical care. You have inflation in housing, and it's doing that once again. So there's inflation in the bond prices, inflation in the stock market. So there's a lot of money, a lot of inflation. But that psychology is going to shift because they're going to realize that they've been, and I think most people who are living on tight budgets, they usually say, I don't have enough money, can you raise my benefit? They never say that the value of my dollar has gone down. It's because you have too much debt and you print too much money. They don't say that. They just need more money. But I think inflation, the conventional definition of prices going up and CPI going up, that's going to hit when these other things are hit. They won't be able to afford it, and that's going to combine with a gigantic revolution for the people to wake up and realize this is a different story than tinkering around with waste, fraud, and abuse.
And of course, the military budget will come back within reason when we realize the policy. What is the role of the United States and the rest of the world? Is it to run things, to be the hegemon, to control the South China Sea, and to control troops in Poland on Russia's border? Once we understand that our role is not to be an empire, then the budget will find a way to right itself, I think.
And I think you've touched on it. It is the role of government. And if they realize that isn't the proper role for our government, it's been shifting for a long time. And of course, it started with the Spanish-American War, where we reached out and started, taking land outside our territory. And it's been going on, but the role of government shifted. It shifted on income taxes, it shifted on the Federal Reserve and printing money, it shifted on foreign policy, it shifted on Keynesian-type economics, of the whole definition of entitlements. And we've lived with that for 100 years, and now we have this $20 trillion that Trump talked a little bit about that. Everybody talks about it, and they say, yeah, it's too high. But how many proposals are we looking at in the Congress right now? We have the House, the Republicans, House, Senate, and the presidency. And we'll have more control of the Supreme Court. Now, what are the odds of them making proposals where there's going to be anything cut? Oh yeah, we're going to cut some waste. Well, what are you going to audit to find out exactly? Well, we don't want to mess around with an audit. That's a little bit too revealing if you have a true audit of what the government is doing. So the spending, unfortunately, is not going to be cut. And they don't even intend to ever pay off anything. And it's always the rate of increase in government and the debt. And I think a couple of years from now, you're going to see, once again, the deficit on an annual basis being well over $1 trillion. And it'll be totally not the importance of the role of government you talk about. The other one is confidence in the system. Why we are in the doldrums now, economically speaking, is there's no confidence in the system. There hasn't been enough confidence to invest the money in businesses. And a lot of the things Trump says is absolutely correct, that jobs are overseas, people invest overseas because the tax code and regulations, he wants to change that, and that is good. But it's not that simple, because they have to deal with what is built into the system. And right now we have the next recession built into the system. The only question is how severe it'll be and how long it's going to last. But when you do the amount of malinvestment and deficit financing and printing of money that we have been engaged in, especially in this century and especially since 2009, it's not going to, that big problem is not going to be touched when it comes to tinkering with this military budget. We have to change what should the role of government be, and that is the big question. And you know what? I think if you put a question out to the American people and say, how do you object to the idea that we promote a government that would protect your personal liberty and your personal privacy? Would you object to a government that protects property rights and your privacy and your ability to do voluntary exchanges with people socially and economically? And do you think it's time maybe we ought to mind our own business and we don't have to be involved in every single war in the world, and we're not the policemen of the world? How many people do you think would answer that question favorably? I happen to think a lot of people would.
Put that way, I think they would.
Yeah, I hope so. And I want to thank everybody for tuning in today. And to me, it's important that we talk about the proposal that we dealt with today. There's some good suggestions there, and there's no reason not to do it. I always support anything that would cut down on waste, fraud, and abuse, because that at least would be making an effort. But my point has been made over 20 years that that's not the issue. Like Daniel said, it's understanding what the role of government ought to be. And if we don't ask that question, we won't have the answer. We're going to continue to do what we do. And I was disappointed that one of the major appointees by Trump says, well, I don't know whether it's time yet we audit the Fed. So I think the time has passed, and we'll keep working on that because eventually it's going to be the big issue, just as foreign policy is the big issue. And that is why hopefully we can continue to get our message out. And I want to thank you very much for being with us today to the Ron Paul Liberty Report. Please come back soon.
Ron Paul Liberty Report on YouTube and RonPaulLibertyReport.com. Go to YouTube, subscribe, check them out. Are we really going to change our foreign policy? It's definitely not going to happen overnight. Trump's administration's just in there. We will have to see what he plays on, but going in to take out ISIS has been one of his, calls to duty that he wants to do. What does that mean, though? Is this going to be, we go in, take out the bulk of ISIS and then get out of there? Or is it, we spend another 10 years in the Middle East? Do we try to put up bases more than we already have in the Middle East? Or do we pull out and also, take our bases out? Do we let these areas govern themselves? We might not always like what comes out of it, and then we can, make that decision. If they become radical, any religion, and they're persecuting other religions, let's bet that and try to help those individuals, because there are people out there that will help. And, people go, whoa, we got to close the border and stop immigration. It's not immigration that we have to stop. And really, you're not going to stop crazy people. It's extremely hard to do that. But we can take certain measures to try to, weed out as much as we can without being, extremely, discriminating against certain people. There's ways to do it. You have people that claim to be kind of psychics, where they're literally, they read people. They literally see every tick and every eye movement, every, twitch. They hear different tones of voices. They analyze that. They're in a way kind of a genius to a point that they can analyze these things in people. And some of them try to, I'm a psychic. No, they really just analyze everything. And there are ways to vet people, definitely in a crisis situation where you're trying to eliminate any of the people committing the atrocities to get out. But what we've seen is, just a kind of, I'm going to turn my back and you do what you need to type attitude. A lot of this would not be a problem as much if people were able to defend themselves. You know, that was one thing that was said about America. Basically, to try to invade America, there's, you know, a gun behind every door. That's not true anymore. And, you know, other countries, even though there weren't as many guns, there were still, you know, a decent amount of guns. These were what in certain times had helped rebellions, small rebel groups. Um, you know, they had their hunting rifles. And here in America, we had hunting and military rifles. It just, you know, collectors or, you know, someone's personal weapon that they were able to keep or a import. There was a thought process from people that looked at that and said, you know, that's just, you probably wouldn't want to invade America. Well, it was because America would defend itself. Not the government, not just the military and the government, but every man, woman, and child. That was a fear that foreign, you know, enemies had. It was self-defense. These people have their freedom. They have the ability to self-defense. And I argue that that wasn't completely true. But as we break the barriers of racism and, you know, the gender gaps, even though we have a lot of groups out there that claim to be fighting for that more are trying to start controversy, either because they have a misunderstanding of the facts or they really want attention. Then we have others that truly, you know, are looking at facts and going, you know, this is happening, which we've called some of that out really early on, when I started going on radio. Talked about, you know, women in the military. There's gaps there. Doesn't mean that I agree that in certain situations that, not that someone should be treated unequal, it's that they should be treated equal, in the sense that, you know, maybe we don't want to put a situation where we have multiple relationships going on, which, you know, that's somewhat in place, but they expect the military not to have, let's say, human urges. And again, I think that's why deployment terms need to be lessened. But again, I don't think you're going to have that when you have too many people and bases spread out throughout the world. You're not going to get that because not only are you spread out, two, you have people that don't want to join because they don't see it as I'm going to defend the country. They see it as I'm going to get deployed somewhere to fight some people that haven't done anything to me or my family or my community here. And you got to realize too, many of us understand, you know, we were older when 9/11 happened. We seen this go on. We were affected by this. There are the youth now that are coming up that they were small. It's glimpses in their memory. They remember, you know, seeing something on TV and everybody was scared, but they kind of lose what it was before that because they were just too young. They didn't grow up, for a decade or, couple decades before 9/11. That pre 9/11 America. They came up right at the very end of that, and bam, America was changed, and they have grown up with that America. We kind of forget that when we see the protesters, when we see these people that are being influenced by radical leftists, which then only inspire the radical right. And when I say radical, I mean they are haters. They have extreme hate for the other side, and they want to dominate. Where I believe both sides that aren't extreme radicals, and even the extreme radicals, are very just misinformed, in a way brainwashed. And I think when you start looking at freedom and what freedom truly stands for, I think that kind of, it starts breaking down those walls. But you have to be willing to truly listen and research what individual freedom. You have to read, philosophers that talked about, these libertarian, they weren't called libertarian all the time, but the philosophy of libertarianism or voluntarism. The a lot of people would consider, it as anarchy, which it would be, but anarchy has also been one of those words that has been stolen by the radical, socialists and communists. It they don't understand anarchy when they call for a government that will, go after another part of the population. That's not anarchy. That's a dictatorship, or, a political dictatorship. Now, what's going to come out of this administration? We've already seen the start, but I think we're going to have to look about a year in, year and a half in, and see what he does. But if he's looking to get reelected, he's going to have to be very strategic on what he puts out there that will appeal, make it easier on the everyday person. They will have to see that in the first term. So he wouldn't be able to do anything radical. Now, if he thinks there's no way I'll get reelected, which I don't think Donald Trump sees that, but if he did, then he would just go full out, just blowing through it. Now, there's also the third thing. If he, thinks he understands everything about, the foreign affairs, economic policy, everything, he believes that he's educated himself that much on all these things, he might still go all out thinking, I'm going to be the best president and re-election will be no problem. It might become a problem because I don't believe everybody knows everything. And, there's a lot of things like foreign policy and pulling bases out that I agree that I don't know every aspect of that. But I know that having 800 plus bases in 70 plus or 100 plus, whatever the number exactly is, um, countries is not the right thing to do. I think most listeners would probably agree. There might be some that disagree, but you have to really take that, in fully. 800 plus bases, which I've heard, I don't know how many have been shut down or, um, had to force to shut down, but we're saying 800 plus conservative number could be 900 plus. That's one number I've heard. And then 70 plus countries could be 100 plus. Um, you take that in, how many assets we deploy around the world, and has that made us safer? This isn't just after 9/11 that we've done this. This was before 9/11. This is what Ron Paul talks about. He believes is part of the you know whole inspiring of ISIS and Al Qaeda, and um, the ability for radicals to recruit is when you have foreign presence. Um, if China, Russia, and all these other countries put a couple bases, 3, 4 bases across the country, and you found out about, hey, that base over there, that's Russian soil. If your kids go playing around there, they might get shot because, well, maybe foreign militaries might not. They might think, well, that might be a bad person running at us. It it gets really choppy when you start doing that, and then you realize, well, if you get bases put in hostile areas, well, you don't know what's coming at you because you're in war mode. If you've ever talked to veterans, when you're in war mode, when you're overseas at war, people running at you are a threat. You don't question it. Even during peacetime, after war, someone running at you is still a threat. This has been something that I've heard from multiple vets, including own family members. Um, my grandpa being one from World War II. Um, he was even stationed over in the Philippines, and he said you never knew, even if it was a child, you never knew if they come running towards you, you that could be your life right there. Now, he never had to fire on anybody running at him, but um, someone, I forget who it was right offhand, but someone from his unit or whatever did, at a cafe. And this was at a time where grenades were being used during peacetime to attack. And a lot of that situation, in the Philippines, happened to be a lot of Japanese soldiers that were bunkered down, no communications, or lost communications, not trusting, the U.S. maybe trying to communicate, did not believe that the war was over. They couldn't believe it. and they wanted to try to keep fighting. Eventually, that came to an end. But we have to really start reassessing how we use our military to try to also not allow it to dictate wars. Another thing a lot of people don't ever really truly consider is going militarily into other countries that have different cultures and religions. This is something that we should have learned through history, where people thought they were going to be these great people and go into all these different, cultures and countries, and be accepted, and their arrogance led to their death because they end up going into a culture or country and extremely offended the culture and religion, and might have been killed. Look at some of the Spanish in the Americas. You just go throughout history, and it's just recounted that these mistakes have been made, and we still do them to this day. The easiest way to become a religious culture's enemy is fulfill the prophecy of being the greatest evil. It's you just gotta be careful at how you approach other people, and that doesn't mean that others are justified in attacking you, but it does show that you do not understand the culture, religion, or the people you are trying to talk to. Doesn't mean you had bad intent, doesn't mean you were evil, but that's kind of like why it's being said now. If you don't already know, kind of take that into account next time you want to go to a completely different country and culture and religion, and walk around temples and other things that you think are great cultural world heritage or whatever you want to call it. Take into consideration maybe looking up where you're not trampling on their sacred grounds. And another thing, that kind of goes back to Trump and his pipelines and the Indian reservation, and I understand the concerns on all sides, and I'm definitely stuck right in the middle. There's legitimate concerns all around, but there's also a lack of listening from all sides, a lack of throwing out all the BS and looking at the actual facts. And I think that this pipeline, where it was put, should have been I think it was naively drawn out where to put this pipeline. Back to that culture, you kind of put the pipeline right there, and you kind of didn't care to think of the cultures in the area maybe that you decided to put this pipeline. It's easier and cheaper. Sometimes cheaper is not easier, and it's definitely not usually always the most considerate. Cheaper can mean that it's child labor that you don't know about, where you pay a little bit more, you know, workers getting paid decent pay. Dow closed at a record high today. Stock markets did very, very well today. Again, they don't really reflect the actual economy. Now we'll see if the actual economy follows this. Give me a second. Sorry. Restart the browser again. Okay. Getting all this back up here. Cool. I want to play this one from the Mises Institute, Mises Media on YouTube. And this one is Nick Sorrentino, and or no, hold on, that's the wrong one. Hold on, I thought I had it up. It's John Tanney. Yep, Trump's economics, and you know, when you look at the stock market and what it's done in Obama's run, and it really didn't reflect what the economy was doing, except for a small point. Towards the end, when it started looking at possibilities for who could be running for president and who might get the presidency, it started reflecting what it believed the policies. It'd waver towards Clinton and it would start kind of dropping a little bit, wave towards Trump and start going up. And a couple times it did the opposite, and that depended on what one of them said on TV. But it was interesting watching it the whole time. And I think under Trump, they are predicting that the U.S. economy will pick up. Now, what I fear is so much of our manufacturing resources have gone overseas. And even though we are doing revolutionary things with our technology, we still have a lot of the components for that technology made overseas. And there are enough Americans that there's no reason we can't manufacture here for a decent price. We want to import cheaper goods and they're a lot cheaper, and we're still paying a big price for the most part. Something that costs 10 cents to make, they charge you $5 for. They're making pretty good profit. And yes, I've seen things like this. I've seen things that they were charging $11 for, and I know for a fact it literally is probably maybe $1 worth of material and maybe 5 minutes worth of work. $11, $12 all day long. And that would be something that could be made cheap here in America, and they're probably paying someone almost nothing to pay, to make these overseas. I forget where it said that it was made. But there's so much woven into that. Also, the monetary policy, something that they've talked about on Ron Paul Liberty Report. But what will Trump's economic policy be, and how will that affect the next 4 years? This again from Mises Media on YouTube. John Tamny, Trump's economics. We're not we're not going to play all of this. We're just going to play a portion of it.
Your host, Jeff Dice.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back once again to Mises Weekend Show. I'm your host, Jeff Dice. We're very happy and pleased to be joined this morning, Inauguration Day Friday, I might add, by John Tamny, a name I'm sure many of you know, but if you don't know, you really ought to be reading and following him. John is the editor of Real Clear Markets. He also writes quite a bit on political economy for Forbes magazine. He is a senior fellow at Reason. And he also wrote a book a couple years that Regnery put out that we carry in our own bookstore called Popular Economics, what the Rolling Stones, Downton Abbey, and LeBron James can teach you about it.
Me on, Jeff.
Well, it is Inauguration Day. I've seen you have written a fair bit about both Trump and some of his cabinet picks. Give us your overarching thoughts. What do you think of Trump, pro and con?
What I like about Trump is probably what many do. He is not like other politicians. I like that he kind of says what's on his mind. At the same time, I'm terrified by him. Trade is the purpose of our work. To import is the reason that we get up and go to work every day. Trump wants to limit our ability. He's bought into this falsehood that's confused thinkers for years that somehow imports are what hurt us, when in fact imports are the reward for all of our work. It also terrifies me that he thinks you can devalue your way to prosperity. Devaluation is the biggest enemy prosperity has ever known, simply because it's the biggest enemy of investment. And so I like the change. I don't like politicians in general, but it terrifies me. He could really be bad if he gives into his worst instincts.
Do you think there's a difference fundamentally between his vision or view of global trade and markets and what Hillary's might have been?
Yes, I legitimately do. Now, I base this on the fact that her husband was a free trader, and I feel like she ultimately would have been guided by some of his logic. I think Hillary moved against free trade simply because she thought it was politically expedient. I think in Trump's case, when you look at his commentary, and you look at his commentary going back to the 80s, we're talking about someone still living in the 1980s who back then felt that Japan was the biggest threat to the United States and thinks China is today. I would make the argument that If Japan and China didn't exist, we'd have to invent them. So good have both those countries been for U.S. economic growth. So it concerns me. I think Hillary would have been more moderate had she been elected. That's not me giving a preference to her, but I think on trade she would have been better.
Well, there's also the areas of nationalism and, of course, war and peace. And as you well know, one knock on libertarians is that we're so focused on trade and economics and GDP, and, we'd sell our grandmothers for a few more points of prosperity. Do you think Trump is less likely maybe to set the world on fire than Hillary would have been?
That's an interesting point. He says interesting things about North Korea, as in that's China's problem, and I tend to agree with that. He tends to say that the rest of the world, particularly the rich world, needs to take on or foot the bill for more of its defense. I think that is ultimately a peaceful concept. I don't think the world is made more peaceful when the U.S. is its policeman. But you hit on something that's important to me that I'm preaching to the choir and saying it to you. Guys like us love economic growth and free trade simply because we think that is the cheapest and best foreign policy mankind ever conceived. And so when people criticize us for our love of open trade and open markets, they miss why we think it's so important, because we love peace more than anyone.
Yeah, it's interesting, though, that they also don't see tariffs and trade sanctions as acts of war, and they don't see domestic aggression against citizens in the form of what I would argue aggression, in the form of regulations and taxes. They don't see that as acts of war amongst our friends on the left.
Yeah, I love how you put that. I think you're so right. And again, between what we know is that when individuals are trading with one another, war becomes very expensive. It becomes costly because they're not serving one another's needs. To bring in someone who's known for being of the left, Joseph P. Kennedy always said to his son John, war's bad for business. And it is. It staggers me that an economics profession, almost to a man and woman, would say that the World War II ended the Great Depression, that war stimulates the economy. Mises put that so well in his book Liberalism, that in fact war is the ultimate depressive concept. But I love how you expand it to beyond the shooting.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, if you recall a few years ago, the earthquakes in Japan caused Honda dealerships across the United States to be short on both automobiles and parts for about 6 months. So the idea that we're ever going to have another war with Japan is a non-starter. But, John, I'd love to turn to your article. It was in Real Clear Markets a couple of days called No, Mr. President-elect, the dollar is not too strong. And I got to tell you, I love this article because there's even a lot of good folks on the free market side. I might throw out Larry Kudlow, who talks a lot about King Dollar. Explain to us, this fetish, this enduring fetish for exports over imports. Why do so many of us believe this?
All I can think is that people still believe after all this time that when people are buying from you, you're prosperous. Well, okay, that's true, but really, why do we get up in the morning every day? Why do we work for dollars? We're working for all the things we don't have. Our goal from the day we start working to long after we retire is to import. That is the source of our prosperity, what we can command in return for our toil. Yet somehow economists have turned that on its head, and it doesn't surprise me. I think it's a ridiculous profession. Economists believe that imports actually hurt us and exports are what strengthen us. What an odd thing.
Well, but you get in the article, you get into how devaluing the dollar simply devalues the power of average people's wages. Let me ask you this. You talk about measuring in yardsticks and how these things don't really matter. Would you agree when Rothbard says we don't care about the money supply per se? Do you think that's correct?
Oh, absolutely. How arrogant for us to presume what the money supply should be. I think Mises put it brilliantly in the theory of money and credit. He said, no, and I paraphrase lightly, no nation or individual need ever worry about having too little money. And his point was, if you're productive, if a country's productive or an individual's productive, money supply is always going to find that individual. Beverly Hills and Greenwich and Manhattan never have a money supply problem because there's lots of productive people in those places. And so you never worry about money. What you worry about is this measure, because that's all it is it stable? Because how awful if you're working for money, and per Mises once again, you're not working for money, you're working for what money can be exchanged for. How cruel if suddenly that ticket that you're working for is devalued, because that's the sole reason you're working to get what you don't have to import. If they're devaluing the currency, they're defeating the sole purpose of your work, because suddenly the dollars you exchange your toil for buy less.
Well, do you think that stability in and of itself is a goal? In other words, if a currency is volatile relative to other currencies or relative to the goods people want to buy, that means that workers have a harder time knowing what they're going to be able to afford, and it means business owners have a harder time knowing their, budgeting their future costs. So, is a rapidly or widely fluctuating currency, is that a bad thing in and of itself?
Of course, it's a bad thing because it deprives money of its sole purpose. Bringing Adam Smith into the conversation, the sole use of money is to circulate consumable goods. I would just add to it, the other sole use of money is to facilitate investment. What are investors buying when they commit capital to new ideas? They're buying dollar or currency income streams in the future. Well, so if the currency is volatile or if it's constantly being devalued, you've reduced a great deal of incentive to commit resources to the future or to delay your consumption of resources. So stability is essential. I'll point out here, my views are evolving. Historically, I've said the best way to do this, markets happened upon gold long ago, is a great way to measure the value of a currency. I'm still for a gold standard, given the choice between what we have now, a floating currency and gold. I think Mises got this right, too, in the theory of money and credit, that if governments didn't create money, obviously market actors would create money very quickly because it facilitates trade among producers. I'm guessing JP Morgan, Walmart, and Visa would do a much better job of creating stable money that we'd all want to earn and exchange with than does the U.S. Treasury.
Well, if stability is good and wild fluctuations are bad, isn't slow erosion bad too? In other words, the Fed has an express policy of about 2% inflation targeting per year. Isn't that crazy too, if we think about it properly?
Oh, it's completely nutty, because I don't have to tell you that if your goal is 2% inflation, what you're going to do is double the price level or devalue the dollar by, name the percentage, over 36 years. The only thing I would say about the Fed is the Fed doesn't view inflation in the way that you and I do. You and I view inflation as a devalue of the unit of account, in our case, the dollar, where it is devalued. The Fed views inflation as too much economic growth, which is really strange, because if you look throughout global economic history, economic growth is the biggest enemy of rising prices mankind has ever known. I cite the original mobile phone was $4,000. The original laser printer was $17,000. Early flat screen TVs cost $25,000 plus. Economic growth pushes down the prices of everything. The Fed thinks, in its infinite unwisdom, that economic growth drives up prices. It staggers me that people take those people seriously.
But even the financial journalism world does. You're an economic and financial journalist. Are you ever shocked at what you read about the Fed in mainstream financial publications?
Jeff, I'll one-up you on that. That is the reason I write about this stuff. I used to work.
Again, that was Mises Media on YouTube. Check them out. Subscribe. You can watch the rest of that. That was John Tamny, Trump's Economics. Now, we've talked about inflation and the value of money, and he was pointing out, a lot of the economists with the Fed and with universities and government, the Keynesians, they believe economic growth is when prices go up. Well, prices go up is actually saying that your dollar is worth less. When you have growth and technology grows, you're able to make things cheaper and cheaper and cheaper, where more and more people can afford it. Now, you do have your, rarities, the super handmade thing, only 3 of them made, and the wealthy people got them. That doesn't mean it's always better. And, wealth is something that people seek. And I think as the U.S. dollar is kind of becoming more of a joke to a lot of people, more people have come aware of, the devaluing dollar. Not all, but there's a good portion. People have, resorted to, investing in things like gold, investing in other things that they could hold other than a piece of paper, something that would hold or gain value. Meaning, as the dollar devalues more and more, those things become worth more and more. And we've already kind of seen this with cars. It was real interesting because, it wasn't but probably, 5 years ago, you would look at a car that was 20 years old, and you would go, okay, there's probably 800, maybe $1,000 car if it was in good shape, maybe 1,500 if it was in good shape, kind of a rare car, but it might have things wrong with it, and it better have under 100,000 miles. Well, now those same cars that haven't had anything done to them are still going for, $1,500 to $800. And things that are newer are going for 5,000 to 8,000. And then you find the good deals in between. But it's amazing watching how cars have increased in price, but not value. Again, value. You want to know the value of a dollar. What is the value of the object the dollar can buy? When you look at cars that are not in great shape and it costs more than it did, that means that even though the car didn't gain value, it costs more. It's not more valuable. It's still a piece of junk rusted out. Hasn't been, kept up on the body work or anything like that. Now it's got, 189, 250,000 miles on it. Now it's 25, 30 years old. It's kind of amazing. I remember when I used to see muscle cars restored, maybe 10 years ago. They might have not been crazy restored where every little thing's been, but they weren't rusted out, solid bodies, no Bondo, original paint, but maybe the interior was reupholstered. Maybe, all the little inside things were redone. Any trim on the outside was polished and done or replaced. Just nice, clean vehicle. I see them going for $2,500. Now you're talking 50,000, 30,000, 100,000, 250,000. The value of the cars haven't gone up. I'm talking about non-rare cars. Ugly cars can still hit, 50,000, 60,000, 80,000. You're like, you could pick up 100 of those. And you would think that maybe they're getting rare. No, they're not getting rare. I see them all the time, type vehicles. Rusted out ones that they still want, $8,000 for, $10,000 for. Seen one the other day. I've been seeing a lot of them. And it was a Chevy Malibu. They wanted $15,000 for this thing. It needed everything. And it wasn't an old, I think it was an 80s Malibu. 81, 80 or 81, I can't remember. But yeah, just not happening. Okay, I want to move on. I kind of digress there. Try to bring this article up if it wants to come up. Maybe. Okay. Now, when it comes to immigration, a lot of people go, well, I thought you were libertarian for open borders. I am up to an extent. When we have a known threat, I think we have a right to defend ourselves, but we're in a situation where government has prevented a lot of people from protecting themselves. Of course, a lot of these people agree with it, so that's part of what they might have to deal with if we don't have a strong defense. But it's really not about stopping immigration. It's stopping people that want to harm innocent people. It's a protection of the community. And Trump wants to build this wall. Congress is still going to have to accept some type of funding agreement for the wall to actually be built, but he's also put a temp ban on refugees. Refugees, I think, become a whole different thing, because definitely when you're talking about, I'm not talking about like refugees from Mexico, which I don't know how you would call yourself a refugee. I guess from the drug wars, but you're kind of running to a country that helps by making everything illegal. So there's catch 22 there. but refugees definitely from way, we're flying them in. We're picking them up and going, come to America. It'd be one thing if they're trying to meet up with family or want to come to America because, this is the land of the free. But we basically have stations where, we kind of recruit refugees anymore. At least from everything I understand. It's kind of awkward. But Trump putting the temp ban on refugees. I'm not sure what we're going to accomplish or do with the immigration and refugee immigration that is actually going to help. But it has to be efficient and fast too, otherwise we're still going to encounter a refugee crisis. And I think the wall would be more devastating to Americans than it would to people trying to get into America. I have one here from AMTV. Donald Trump, build the wall. We'll go ahead and cover this. Then I have an article that'll follow this.
I'm Christopher Green. You're watching AMTV, Alternative Media Television. It is, of course, January 25th, 2017. Build the wall. 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 Donald J. Trump to build the wall in months and get Mexico to pay for it. Although he'll start with U.S. taxpayer funds, and it'll probably be complicated, as Donald Trump was telling the interviewer on ABC News.
There will be a payment. It will be in a form, perhaps a complicated form. And you have to understand, what I'm doing is good for the United States. It's also going to be good for Mexico. We want to have a very stable, very solid Mexico.
Mexico will pay for the wall. President Trump, construction of border wall will begin in months. Take a look at this. This is in his first one-on-one television interview since being sworn in as the 45th President of the United States. President Donald Trump told ABC News anchor David Moore that Mexico would be paying for the proposed border wall and that negotiations between the two nations would begin, quote, relatively soon. Ultimately, it will come out of what's happening with Mexico and will be in a form reimbursed by Mexico, which I've always said. Trump goes on. Take a look at this clip.
Are you going to direct U.S. funds to pay for this wall? Will American taxpayers pay for the wall?
Ultimately, it'll come out of what's happening with Mexico. We're going to be starting those negotiations relatively soon, and we will be in a form reimbursed by Mexico, which I've always said.
So they'll pay us back?
Yeah, absolutely, 100%.
So the American taxpayer will pay for the wall at first?
All it is we'll be reimbursed at a later date from whatever transaction we make from Mexico.
Mexico's president said in recent days that Mexico absolutely will not pay, adding that it goes against our dignity as a country and our dignity as Mexicans. He says, quite simply, they're not paying.
David, I think he has to say that. He has to say that. But I'm just telling you, there will be a payment. It will be in a form, perhaps a complicated form.
Mexico, you will pay for that wall. You're going to cough it up. You see, Donald J. Trump is a man of action, and action speaks louder than words. I mean, Donald Trump, man, have you seen him lately? He is just signing executive actions, left and right. Repealing Obamacare, and now building the wall. This is important because it puts a halt to illegal immigration in this country, which has been destroying our country like a disease. There's a reason why there's an upside-down pyramid scheme here in the United States of America. There's a reason why many of you tuning in will not get the benefits that you counted on. Your pensions will go bankrupt in the future. You will not get Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, all these social benefits that we've all come to expect, paying our tax dollars to support a system that is being overrun illegally through and by migration that hasn't gone through the right process. And again, nobody's against legal immigration. We're against illegal immigration. Now, in addition to that, Donald Trump has essentially put up another wall when it comes to immigration coming from radical jihadi Islamic terror nations. A lot of, again, that overflow created by the Obama administration for a reason, created by the likes of people like George Soros for a reason, to destabilize the host nations through war, terror, murder. And it essentially bankrupts the country from within. I mean, how do you think George Soros has made all of this money? Betting against currencies and helping economies to collapse, etc. Donald Trump throwing a massive monkey wrench in this whole idea, this modern paradigm of globalism, and instead reversing it on its head, now with a mission that we are American-centric, America first, focused, nationalistic, and protectionist. So how is Donald Trump going to get them to pay for this wall? He will creatively, because he's a creative businessman, and his friends are creative financiers. One way or another, Mexico, you are going to cough it up. And this is great. Protects our security, creates jobs. You notice how, if we look at a mental visual chart, while at the same time, going left to right here, Donald Trump is creating thousands and thousands of jobs. At the same time, the protests are increasing in the streets. Why is that? He's creating more jobs, yet the radical leftist special little snowflakes are protesting in the streets. Why? Well, I'll tell you why. They're not interested in jobs. They're interested in free shit. Special little snowflakes. They want the welfare. They want the benefits. They don't want to work. Just like Shia LaBeouf? Buffoon? What does he say? He will not divide us. He will not divide us. He will not divide us. At the same time, he's physically assaulting people and dividing people through his divisive rhetoric on camera, a live stream in New York City, which will be continuing its live broadcast through the entire, and this might be news to you, Shia, 8 years of the Donald J. Trump presidency. 8 years, not 4, because he's going to get reelected. Because it's this same radicalization and insanity and divisiveness being propelled by the radical left as they protest and they march against actions Donald Trump hasn't even taken yet when it comes to women's rights and abortion and these kinds of things, and only help to ignite the fury of the sleeping giant, more than half of the country that voted for this man, the silent majority. So while we watch the protests in the streets, many of us, the millions of Americans that voted for Donald Trump and gave a giant FU to Barack Obama and globalism in general, still remain silent and will cast their vote once again for the next term, at the end of these 4 years, for another 4. Ocho, Mexico. So get used to the wall, get used to paying for it, and get used to Donald J. Trump. Even Kim Jong-un, who had a defector recently leave the embassy, it's propaganda, wants to talk with Donald Trump. Why is this? Well, why do some of the most totalitarian, at least in the eyes of the bullshit mainstream propaganda media, nations want to speak with Donald Trump? Well, I'll tell you why. First of all, a lot of it's just propaganda being fed by the MSM. I mean, how many of you guys have been to North Korea? It's not too different here. I mean, we're just as brainwashed in our illusion of chains and slavery and the walls that they built around us as we've all been institutionalized. It's because Donald Trump is a peacemaker. He's a businessman, and he's strong. Just like Putin, he's a man to be respected. You know, it only goes to show you how piss poor of a job our politicians have done in recent decades to put us in a situation where it's gotten this bad that we have to go back to basics. And Donald Trump isn't a divider. He's a uniter. He will make America great again. Honest to God, a brilliant.
Now, I don't I don't share the views that he shares, because I think a lot of this is an over-enthusiastic response to Trump getting in, again, being a libertarian. I don't see the need for a wall. The problem I see is an attempt to manipulate the culture that America is supposed to stand for. People are like, it's supposed to be a mixing pot. Yes, it's supposed to bring different races together. That's something that has become, you know, the American dream, and without the rhetoric to divide by race or gender, saying that every individual has the same rights. And we have gone so far away from that to this group thought. And groups pin against each other to divide and conquer. And Trump plays a part of that. I hope that maybe the policies do bring people together, not because of Trump, but because of what America can do if we get rid of regulations. But this wall, you know, he promised that, you know, it would get done in months. Well, it might be a little bit more difficult than what he believes or thinks. It'll be seen, but it says here, defense1.com, border officers' real security is more complicated than building a wall. And it really is. That's been proven. But another thing is, you know, the wall can also keep you in. There's something to be said about that aspect of it. You don't have free travel. Even if Mexico allowed you to have free travel, you don't have free travel. Says here, Trump's order notwithstanding, it would take years and new technology to truly close the border. President Trump's new executive orders to extend walls along the U.S.-Mexico border and deport undocumented individuals may have a popular appeal, but achieving real border security will likely take longer than many Trump supporters hope. Quote, we are not ready to do it yet, unquote, said one of U.S. Customs and Border Protection, or CBP, official told Defense One on condition of anonymity at the 11th annual Biometrics for Government and Law Enforcement Summit in Arlington, Virginia. I think it will take years. Even CBP officials who spoke on the record said challenges to fully securing the border and identifying undocumented aliens will extend well beyond the construction of a wall. Right now, CBP catches 85 to 95% of undocumented people crossing the border, according to Antonio Trinidad, CBP's Director of Enforcement Systems. Is that secure? If one bad guy, really, really bad terrorist, comes over the border illegally, we failed with one person, Trinidad said. Again, that was out of Defense One. And you can read the rest of that there. And then I also have this article. This one is from Google. Mexico braced for a confrontation with Trump team. Battle lines have been drawn as Mexico and U.S. kick off what promise to be tough negotiations on the future of the 2 decades-old North American Free Trade Agreement, which both sides have threatened to kill off if they don't get their way. Pressure from U.S. President Donald Trump has already cowed U.S. corporate investors operating in Mexico. President Enrique Peña Nieto has vowed to stand up to pressure from the White House, but with NAFTA as the backbone of Mexico's export-oriented economy, he has most to lose from the talks. And again, if being the exporter instead of the importer was so good, Mexico would be booming, because they do export. They just have to export for cheap. If there's no clear benefits, there's no point staying. Ildefonso Gorgerado, Mexico's economy secretary, told a television interviewer, a worse deal for Mexico made no sense, he said. Mr. Gorgerado and Foreign Secretary Luis Videgaray traveled to Washington on Wednesday for meetings with officials including Reince Priebus, White House Chief of Staff Peter Navarro, National Trade Council head, and Jared Kushner, Mr. Trump's son-in-law and top advisor. The two presidents are scheduled to meet at the White House on January 31st, using similar rhetoric to the America First language of the Trump administration. Mr. Videgaray said on Tuesday that Mexico would put its interests first in the talks. We are a sovereign nation and nothing can come above the interests of Mexico and the Mexicans, he said. Any agreement that is proposed that infringes or endangers Mexico's social and economic interests and which harm the dignity of our nation will be unacceptable. NAFTA, enforced between the U.S., Mexico, and Canada since 1994, when Mexico was emerging as a market economy, has intertwined relations via cross-border supply chains and increased trade, investment, and jobs that one former official said were now difficult to unscramble. Mexico sends about 80% of its exports north of the border, but those goods contain as much as 40% U.S. content, helping support nearly 5 million jobs in the U.S. All that could be at risk if, as Mr. Trump has warned, the U.S. does not achieve what it considers a fair deal for American workers and decides to pull out, as he has already done, from the 12-nation Trans-Pacific Partnership that Mexico saw as a way to equip NAFTA for the 21st century. On Monday, Mr. Peña Nieto said everything, not just trade, was on the table. The solution is dialogue and negotiation, he said, to applause from an audience of officials and business leaders who earlier heard Juan Pablo Castañón, head of business lobby CCE, call for a Mexico First philosophy. So that's going to heat up even more when Trump claims, oh, Mexico's going to pay for the border. And you got to realize how much stuff we have that's made in Mexico right now. Our machinery's in Mexico. American companies own machinery that they moved to Mexico. And look at the price of everything. You know, a decent truck anymore, it's more than a house payment for many. So, by bringing those jobs back, which won't happen immediately, therefore a lot of the parts that are made there will cost more, and then until then, and then after that, when you have American workers making a lot more an hour, those parts cost more. The price of everything will go up. And I think that's when you start seeing the real economy, and that's when we start trying to figure out what we're going to do to keep it from collapsing. Hopefully it doesn't get that bad. Hopefully it doesn't go that far. But, you know, we can definitely see a bubble coming out of this with the stock market jumping so high. And no real laid out plan for America and our economy. He might have his ideas of what he wants to do, but we really don't know all the plays that he's willing to make and how far he's willing to take things. And if most of what Americans can afford is the foreign imports from China and Mexico that you get at Walmart, or other countries that you get at Walmart or Kmart or Target or any store that you go to. A lot of people can't afford all American made, nor can you find all American made everything. We tend to rely more on things that are made in foreign markets than we believe. That doesn't mean that we don't try to get more factories here, and I don't think people wouldn't be willing to pay just a little bit more for the American made thing, as long as it's not triple the amount. And I think as people that might be out of work looking for a job should look at something that's decently above minimum wage, but not that great, you know. Don't take that job for granted and try to make it better. Make your product, services, experience better. That way you can move up or create for yourself. And again, what can help that is when government gets out of the way from the small business owner, the entrepreneur, the people that want to do something but tend to be kind of hindered by regulations that, even though they might affect big business, they mostly affect small business. It's something that big business can usually work around, but small business can't afford to. So, helping out big business, having automakers around and all this is one thing, but what about the mom and pop stores, the small, family owned companies, um, you know, the owners bringing in, 60,000, 50,000, and they could be making 100,000 working for someone else, but they rather, you know, try to succeed on their own, try to provide for the community, and we can't put laws and regulations to hinder that. That doesn't mean that business should be allowed to run, roughshod and harm others, but we can hold them accountable for that if they attempt it. That's really the key. We tend to let people off with a slap on the wrist, not hold them accountable, and then complain about, these people do all these things, but when they do them, you kind of blow it off. That's a change that, we have to take these type of things a little more serious. And as we are going to finish up this broadcast, again, don't forget to check out We Are Change and, Ron Paul Liberty Report. Check those out on YouTube. Also, AMTV and UCY.TV, of course. Now, one way you can help alternative media like UCY.TV is if you go to UCY.TV, scroll down towards the bottom, and there's a little Amazon button. You click the Amazon button, and it'll take you to Amazon through UCY.TV. You get the same great deals, same great shipping rates, everything, that you would normally get through Amazon. And at the same time, UCY gets a little kickback that helps cover operating costs. In no way does this affect your price or your shipping price. Exact same thing, just saying, hey, I support this partner. And, prepping is one thing that I've always pushed for. And it doesn't mean you have to be extreme prepper, but I think you should make some preparations in case of a natural disaster, economic collapse, foreign invasion. You never know what could happen. Earthquake, tornado, hurricane, volcano, forest fire. You never know what could happen. And Amazon really does have really good deals. And just, think you go to prep, you want to buy these things, you want some of the best deals you can find out there. You're going to find them on the internet, and you're probably going to find them at Amazon. And by shopping through that link, you can help out alternative media at the same time. And, this is something that's not supported by big corporations. I'm sure they dislike many shows because we call people out for who and what they are based on the evidence that we have found. So, it's really imperative that people support alternative media and let them know that you're listening and you care. Don't forget to also go to antityrannynews.com/mypatriot. That'll take you to My Patriot Supply. They are my preferred source for non-GMO seeds. They got great seed vaults out there. You do an acre crisis garden, and you can feed a lot of people. They also have other prepping gear, but I'm telling you, I want to know where my non-GMO seeds come from. I've seen others out there, but what I have gotten from my Patriot Supply just it blew me away, and I'm extremely happy with that. Also, don't forget to go to antityrannynews.com/medal. That'll take you to Moggy Medals.